everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Finding Success with Jamf with our special guest, Thom O'Connor from Cargill. We're really excited to talk about all the exciting things that they are doing when it comes to using Apple devices, Jamf, and how they are integrating with their Microsoft solutions. So just a quick overview of our agenda today. This is going to be more of a casual fireside chat or coffee chat. I hope you brought coffee with. And Thom is going to walk us through how they're leveraging Jamf, how they have been implementing Mac and M1 adoption. And then they're going to talk about how they have been leveraging not only Jamf, but how they are integrating it with Microsoft and working hand in hand. They're going to talk about their challenges and successes and overall just where they have found it to include their Apple devices in their already existing Microsoft solutions. So without further ado, I am very excited to welcome Thom O'Connor.
Hey, Kat. Thank you for having me. Yeah, definitely excited to be here. Thanks for the nice intro. So hi, everybody. My name is Thom O'Connor. I'm an enterprise Apple architect at Cargill. So I basically manage all the Apple devices that come through Cargill's doors, making sure they get deployed to the right people, making sure they get enrolled in Jamf, making sure they're secure, all that good kind of stuff. So I've been with Cargill for almost 3 years now. I was responsible for their Jamf implementation, their stand-up and everything. And I've been a customer of Jamf with various different companies for about 7 or 8 years. So I've done a lot of implementing Jamf, bringing it into the environment, bringing macOS devices into existing ecosystems is kind of my forte. That's why I think Kat and I really connected on this topic. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing a bit about yourself. I guess without really taking too much time, I would love for you to tell us a bit about your current existing device setup, maybe a bit of a breakdown of how things are looking, just to kind of give our audience some familiarity with your current infrastructure.
Yeah, sure. So like most large enterprises, we're primarily a Microsoft shop. We've got over 100,000 devices in about 70 countries around the world. We're looking at just under about 1,000 macOS devices now, but we're growing strong since we've been implementing the service. More people are signing up for it. They're finding success with Apple products, thanks to Jamf and thanks to what Apple's doing. And then we're slowly onboarding an iPad and Android service as well. It's growing actually pretty darn quickly. So that's kind of the lay of the land at the moment.
So just to clarify, you've got just about 1,000 Macs. Out of how many Windows devices would you compare that to?
Yeah, just over 100,000 around the world. So yeah,
that's pretty exciting ratio. I have to ask and wonder, how did your organization get Macs and why?
Yeah, like a lot of enterprises, I'm sure we're seeing it really comes down to kind of employee choice. Depending on the industry or the field that you're working in, you're going to have lots of business units or lots of departments within your enterprise that are interested in using Macs, whether that be development, whether that be creatives, whether that just be road warriors who like the slickness of walking in with a MacBook Air. But wherever it is, it really came down to folks wanted to use Macs because they felt more productive on it. Whether that was because they're just used to the operating system, they're used to how the device handles updates and how the whole interface works. Maybe they just had one in college and they don't want to switch over to a Windows device. Or they're developers. Macs, as we all know, are very, very popular in the development community for a whole bunch of obvious reasons. Anyone who's watching this presentation probably knows why they're already popular among developers. So yeah, we had a large number of primarily developers and creatives who really wanted to use Macs. And Cargill they try to be as agile as possible, very flexible and very understanding of the business unit's needs in order to keep them as productive as possible. So we started looking into what MDM platform is going to get us there. And Jamf is definitely the best in breed. And they had actually decided upon Jamf before I got there, and they brought me in basically to do the stand-up of it and do the implementation of the service. And it was an easy yes for me, because as soon as I heard they were using Jamf, I was like, yep, that's exactly what we want to be doing, 100%. So no problems there. And that's kind of how it all came about.
Thank you. No, that's really great background. And I think a lot of folks can relate or are at a similar step. I know a lot of enterprise organizations are thinking about choice, have been approached about choice. They know their employees want it. And it's just one of those things where it's exciting to hear you not only helped implement it, but it sounded like there was buy-in. I want to say, speaking of Macs, you've been using Macs for a little while, it sounds like. And M1 is pretty new technology. With new technology, there's always perhaps some hesitancy, or does this play nice with everything else? Can you confirm that you are onboarding M1s for us and what that's been like?
Yeah, we are currently onboarding M1s. It wasn't an immediate thing as soon as M1s came out. You know, Apple releases a new major OS. You kind of have to wait for your third-party security tools or maybe some of your third-party productivity apps to be able to catch up and work with the new operating system. And M1 was basically just kind of like an exacerbated version of what happens kind of every year, because Big Sur changed a lot under the hood. Moving from kernel to system extensions like they did in Lake Catalina. And then, of course, the new hardware chipset with the M1. Not all third-party security tools and third-party productivity apps were necessarily ready to go. Now, luckily, all of our vendors are supporting it, and we are able to onboard M1s in our environment. And folks are seeing a nice reduction in cost compared to the Intel models. And also an increase in speed and productivity due to the quickness of the M1 chip for a lot of those day-to-day tasks. Yeah.
No, that's great. And I'm really glad to hear that, especially as we think of people already using devices. We need to refresh their devices. We also provide same-day support to help make it easier for organizations like yours with all of our solutions.
It's a very good point, actually. Not to cut you off. That's a really good point, actually, because Jamf was one of the tools that we did not have to worry about waiting for them to support M1s. They were ready to go right out of the gate. So that's a really good point right there. Yeah.
Yeah, just want to make sure. I was like, I hope everyone got to leverage that, or at least find that. So that's good. So I'm really glad to hear that, and that same day support was available and helped kind of ease things.
Yeah.
When we think of all that and we think of putting it together with the M1 and adoption, you mentioned choice a moment ago as an additional layer. I know what we're talking about, a lot of organizations aspire to have, and you mentioned, hey, it didn't happen overnight, but when we look at the timeline, it happened still relatively quickly for you. It happened within a year. You have choice, you're adopting M1. And what I'm getting at is that's something organizations really aspire to have, but perhaps they're just not quite sure to get there. So how are you working perhaps internally and making these things happen when it comes to embracing these new updates, embracing choice? And why is that important to Cargill?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it really comes back to kind of that first question of the business understanding what keeps folks productive, what keeps their business units happy, focused, and productive. And also them understanding that IT is an ever-changing product market. Just because something is implemented one day doesn't necessarily going to mean it's going to work in a year or two, or even less than that, depending on how often the program or the operating system that you're using is going to get updated. Helping the key decision makers within your organization kind of understand that how Apple works, how Apple is moving ahead, and Apple is usually ahead of the game with a lot of these security features, which if you can always spin the security side, that's always a good way to make decision makers happy. So that usually helps. And I think a lot of the mystery that a lot of enterprises have is they're a bit shy maybe to reach out to a company like answers to some questions that maybe they don't even know to ask the right questions. But Jamf is full chock to the brim with just loads of people who can answer all these questions and help navigate getting through it. Having key decision makers get into the conversation and really get on board with saying, hey, we need to support this. And instead of just saying, oh, it's too difficult and we don't know how, to instead say, let's figure out how we can do this. Let's reach out to some subject matter experts. Let's reach out to some product developers and owners who have done this. And just being positive and being engaging with those key decision makers and coming in with a little bit of expertise definitely helps.
No, thank you. I think that is something that a lot of organizations have expressed to me, where they're like, how do we get from point A to point B? And I think you articulated that quite well. I appreciate that. One could argue, though, when I think of the numbers that you mentioned, you've got just around 1,000 Macs, you've got over 100,000 PCs. I know you had mentioned Jamf was ultimately chosen before you arrived, and maybe you have some insight into this, because one could argue That's not a lot of Macs compared to PCs. The ratio is just very significant. Why did you ultimately land on leveraging Jamf as a special solution for your Macs?
Yeah, as anyone who's a Mac admin will probably tell you, a lot of times, whether it's a security product, whether it's a productivity app, or whether it's an MDM, Macs and Apple devices in general are usually kind of the last devices that are thought of by that product. They kind of do all of it, right? And that's great if that's what your enterprise is into. But it's kind of like the equivalent of like, if I want a really nice meal, I'm not like the Cheesecake Factory is fine, but that menu is so big that they don't necessarily do everything great. But if you go to, like a specialty steakhouse, that's where you're going to get your kind of specialty steak. And to me, Jamf is that specialty steakhouse. And what Jamf specializes in is managing Apple devices. And then that you can kind of see just with their track record of 0-day support. Everything is built with Apple in mind from the ground up. It's the only thing that they do to support. So the term best in class or like best in breed certainly comes around. And it's well known that Jamf is the way to go within the marketplace now. It wasn't always that way, like when they were an up and coming company, but they've established themselves to the point that, if Intune or Microsoft or any of these major companies are going to look at integrating Mac or iOS products into their environment, the first MDM that they're going to make sure that it works with is Jamf because it's got such a big footprint in the MDM marketplace for Apple devices. And a lot of looking like I said, they had decided on Jamf kind of before I got to Cargill, but I've made a career out of kind of standing up Jamf at a lot of different companies that have done the research, and they've all decided that Jamf was the way to go because of all those reasons, basically.
Well, thanks for showing that value, and also thanks for comparing us to a specialty steakhouse. Apologies, I any vegetarians listening in, but you
sorry.
I was going to say though, so this is kind of a nice transition into where you are finding that success, right? We're talking about Jamf, we're talking about integrating Apple, but at the end of the day, you are primarily a Windows shop and a Microsoft shop. I want to kind of hone in on one area as we start to then kind of navigate towards Endpoint Managers and Intune. We'll use both interchangeably in this conversation, but I want to just kind of put a spotlight real quick on iOS because you are using us for iOS. We've been known as the leader in Mac management, and so many folks would argue MDM platforms are usually the same. Any reason why you also decided to leverage Jamf not only for Mac but for iOS, and any key differences in your findings or things that surprised you as you were leveraging us not only for Mac but for iOS?
Yeah, that is a good call out that a lot of times, folks will think, if you're going to manage a whole bunch of devices, it makes sense to kind of do them in the same MDM, even if it's different platforms. And while the Mac space has a lot more to configure with Jamf, like you can do a lot more with Jamf on a Mac than you can with a Mac and let's say, Intune Mobile and some of those competitors. But iOS and iPadOS are kind of, they're smaller environments, right? Like not the footprint, but just the operating system itself is a bit smaller. So the amount of stuff that you can do with Jamf is still limited by the amount of stuff Apple lets you do. That said, internally for us at Cargill, everyone was just so satisfied with how well Jamf was working for Mac that when it came time to onboard iOS and iPadOS, it was just a no-brainer. It was like, well, if this product can do all of this other stuff so well, we've got a great relationship with the vendor. Our architect likes working with them for support already. It's just a no-brainer to continue going down that same path and leverage all the great, the Apple Business Manager integration we've already got going, the zero-touch stuff we've already got going, so much of the API hook-ins for automation that we've already got going. It's just we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. It was just kind of we already love this product. Let's just get another helping of it. To use the
Works for me. So I want to just kind of start to hone in because Microsoft is an amazing partner of ours. And what you're hitting on and the picture I'm trying to paint is you are leveraging the concept of ecosystem management. The use one solution for your Apple devices, which is Jamf, and then use a really good solution for your Windows devices, which is Intune Endpoint Manager. So what I want to learn more about, and that I think a lot of our listeners in this presentation would love to know, what solutions are you using in your primarily Microsoft infrastructure?
Solutions in terms of like how we're integrating Jamf and Intune, like how are we?
Yeah, so you're using Jamf for your Apple devices. You're using Intune for your Windows devices, and that's that concept we talk about all the time, and that we preach about, ecosystem management. And you have found ways to integrate, and I would love to kind of know, how you're what Microsoft solutions perhaps you're using in general, and then perhaps we'll just start
Oh
kind of
yeah,
talking
sure.
about integration.
Yeah, so on the Microsoft side, we're a full like Office 365 shop. So Outlook, all that Exchange, and all that good stuff, as most enterprises use. The real key Microsoft integrations, I'd say, and the ones that Jamf helps us provide, are conditional access and device compliance reporting. So being able to register a device and have Jamf report the compliance directly to Intune or to Azure AD or to Endpoint Manager, however you want to say it, is something that our identity management team and our security teams were incredibly happy about, because a big concern is how do you get the level of device control and incredible user experience that you get with Jamf, but also the level of security within the Microsoft wheelhouse that, like, that your security folks, our identity management folks, are already using. And as I mentioned, I don't remember what question it was, but when Microsoft or any of these big companies are going to look at at integrating their Apple products, Jamf is one of the first companies they look at with integrating. So whether that's kind of the old school, using Jamf to launch your company portal app to get it registered to Endpoint Manager, or whether Microsoft's relatively new feature, which is third-party compliance partners, Jamf was right there as the first folks that they supported for doing that. So that level of integration satisfies our identity management team, and it satisfies our security team. It makes device management much easier because I can still manage it with the tool I want while still being compliant with security and still having conditional access requirements met.
I think that's really key, as you started talking, where we think about how do we check the boxes but also maintain compliance with other areas of the organization. And I think that's really key when it comes to not only just using Jamf for your Apple devices, but talking through our integrations. And yes, you can use what you're using, or you've got your Windows devices, and we've got just so many integrations. And I love that you're able to leverage so many of those. And it's got me thinking a little bit when we talk about how you were like, hey, we're satisfying security and identity. It kind of sparked a question as to how you're enrolling and adding Macs as they grow. Like, what does that setup look like? And did that procedure change, or how is Jamf helping? Because I think that's something when we talk about onboarding Macs, especially now with so many of us remote, how does that look like for Cargill as you're enrolling and adding Macs?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's definitely a challenge that almost any enterprise that's going to try to start onboarding an entire new OS platform into their environment is going to see. Like most Windows shops, which is most enterprises, they've got their depoting down. You're shipping devices to us, we're imaging them. We've got a whole team, a whole department that's getting the device ready for the end user and shipping them out. And really, the future is in zero touch deployment, where you just ship the device directly to the end user and have Apple Business Manager, or if you're Windows, use Autopilot, and then have your MDM, in our case Jamf, with pre-stage enrollment configuration, get any package that you need installed, get all the configuration profiles installed, running enrollment scripts, and we have a whole custom enrollment package. We've got a nice GUI that we made through Jamf Helper that helps get identity information. And really smooths it all out. So yeah, we're basically leveraging kind of exactly what Apple and Jamf preach, which is have a third-party reseller get linked up with Apple Business Manager. When the purchase is made, it goes into that portal. Use that portal, configure it to your MDM, which in our case is Jamf, and then within Jamf, configure the pre-stage enrollment, and Bob's your uncle, as they say. And it's definitely something that is, I'm not going to say it's like, you need obviously technology to set it up, but I think a lot of enterprises are, again, kind of coming back to what we were saying before, where it's a little bit shrouded in mystery, so it seems more challenging and intimidating than it really is once you kind of get in there and understand how good these solutions are from these amazing companies.
No, that's great. And it's it's helpful to hear. And I think it's one of those things where as you're setting things up, as you compare, right, to how you're leveraging or the steps you take for a Windows shop, how can you mirror what you're doing for your Macs and your Apple devices? And I think that's really key. So I'm pleased to hear that you're leveraging zero touch, that you're finding ways to not only streamline it, but essentially making sure that you don't have to image the devices or, take into account how to make it like what we're doing with the Windows devices. It's again, how do we check these boxes, but do it the way that needs to be done to accommodate this platform best.
Right. I think one of the key things is, again, it kind of comes down to the key decision makers as well. But overall, if your enterprise has a mentality of like, we are not a Microsoft shop or an Apple shop and we need to manage them separately, the idea is that we're a business that does our business. And all of these tools are just productivity tools to help our business succeed. And if you have that mentality, it's a lot easier to, dive into onboarding a new application or a new operating system platform or a new any kind of technology, really. It just lessens the fear, I think, a little bit. I don't know how tangible that advice is, but just be open. I guess is the idea. Yeah.
No, it's a good way to think about it, and what you have found in your experience for folks as they're having these discussions. Maybe it's a change of perspective, and I want to, I guess, kind of hone in and talk a little bit about some of these challenges. You make it sound easy, but I know it wasn't entirely easy. So I want to talk about, what are some of the challenges perhaps you faced in your infrastructure with Apple and Windows, and how did you resolve it? And I think a lot of it is finding the balance in your Windows and Apple infrastructure. I know you kind of hinted at that, but is there anything that you can expand on perhaps in that area?
Yeah, I think the challenge with managing any kind of client endpoint is the never-ending balance in IT of security versus usability, and that seesaw that kind of always goes back and forth. As I mentioned before, our macOS footprint is heavily populated by developers, and developers know how computers work. So when you install a product on their computer and now all of a sudden it's slow, there's no mystery about it. They know how to go into the activity monitor and see that the tool that you just installed is perhaps using an extra chunk of CPU that wasn't being used before, and that having a stick and a carrot is kind of always a good idea. So in our case, the stick, which was I was kind of both the carrot and the stick, really. But the idea is that the stick really comes from security, saying, hey, these devices are unmanaged and the work that you're doing on them is insecure. So we're going to start locking down your ability to access the resources that you need until your device comes into compliance. Then the carrot is, well, yes, it kind of sucks that, maybe you're going to have like an extra security tool or two on your device. You're going to have a couple more restrictions in order to keep the company safe. But the upside is, hey, we'll be able to support you so much better. We'll be able to streamline your application deployments. We'll be able to streamline the onboarding process for your business unit. We're going to save you money. You're going to get enrolled in our AppleCare Enterprise solution. Having kind of a carrot and a stick kind of at the same time is kind of the best way to go, I'd say.
You had mentioned a word that stands out to me, and I think to a lot of listeners, and pretty much any organization, whether you're the IT admin, Mac admin, mobile team, InfoSec team, and that word is security. And I want to focus on that for a bit as we think of what you've shared with us so far. We think of your infrastructure. How is Jamf helping with your security stack for your Macs that perhaps impacts your overall greater infrastructure?
Yeah, Jamf does a great job. One of the wonderful things about Jamf is smart groups. If anyone here uses Jamf, I'm sure you've got loads of smart groups, just like we all do. And the great thing about smart groups, which I think Jamf actually patented, which they should if they haven't yet, but I think they did.
We have.
You have? Good. So it's and Jamf, it lends itself to creative administrators, I'd say, because the tool set to kind of do anything you want to do is there with Jamf. So if you want to write a script or write a daemon or write an extension attribute that's going to detect whether something is installed, you can then populate a smart group based off that information, then create a policy scope to that smart group. So let's say, for example, security product X, we want to make sure it's installed. Great. We'll make an extension attribute to detect whether or not it's present on a device. And if that device reports an inventory where it's not installed, it gets thrown into a smart group. And we have a policy set up that's to an ongoing nature to, go ahead and run this installation on any device that falls into this smart group. The beautiful thing about Jamf is that if security has a concern, if you're creative enough, you can always figure out a way to make Jamf do whatever you need it to do to satisfy that security need. And we've had great success with doing that with a variety of products.
I'm really pleased to hear that you are finding success with our smart groups. That is something that is unique to us. And you also had mentioned extension attributes. And it's one of those things where, in my mind, extension attributes and smart groups can really benefit folks listening in. Do you have an example that you can perhaps share with listeners?
Yeah, I don't want to I don't want to mention any specific products that we're using or anything like that. But pretty much the example I kind of just gave of let's make sure security product X is installed. Let's create whether that presence is there and then a policy to go ahead and do that. Yeah.
No, that's perfect. I know you can't share too much. I know security is a touchy subject as well, so I want to be mindful of that. But thank you. One thing I wanted to focus in on: our API is known to help with enabling integrations. I know I've mentioned you've been integrating with Microsoft, and many of these decisions that you make as an organization are around security. Can you tell me more about how you're leveraging the API and what integrations you are leveraging with Jamf, or if there's anything creative you might be doing?
Yeah, so Jamf has a really extensive API, whether you want to do something like add a device to like a static group collection, whether you want to pull information and that sort of thing. So we use a tool that basically gathers licensed application software that's installed on devices to make sure we don't become out of compliance with our license counts and that sort of thing. That particular product had some limitation. The Mac OS version, I should say, had some limitations, so they weren't able to get quite all the information we need. But Jamf does collect all the great application data that's out there on the devices. So what we were able to do is use Microsoft Orchestrator to create some automation that will go and grab those computer inventory records through our Jamf API and then publish that information to an SQL database that our other tool was then able to ingest. So again, just kind of similar to the other point, where if you're kind of creative and you kind of think about what really needs to be done, Jamf is going to have some tools there that are going to be able to get you there. And the API, to your point, is one of those tools. Absolutely. We also use the API. For example, we have a nice centralized place where folks can either submit tickets if they have a problem, or they can submit requests. So things like licensed applications, let's go there again, for example. So rather than needing my team to go in and deploy it specifically to a device, we'll use our centralized application requesting system to then fire off a job from the API to add or this device to that collection to then deploy it to them. Just another great use of the API to kind of make the man hours needed to run the whole system just so much less than it normally would be.
No, I think that's something that a lot of folks are always trying to figure out, how do we automate? How do we make it so we can be proactive versus reactive? And I think that's a really great example of that. I know we got just a little bit of time. I wanted to ask just a few questions, because you've been working with Jamf for a while at Cargill and at previous organizations. Where do you continue to see value in as you leverage us for the Apple devices, and why? I just feel like it's a fair question to ask, why us?
Yeah, I think I don't know if I've just been really lucky, but every Jamf rep or tech support person I've ever worked with is super knowledgeable, super friendly, and really, really responsive, which is not something I've had the luxury of with a lot of other vendors. Maybe I'm just lucky. I don't know. I like to think it's not just me, because I've heard the same things from lots of other Jamf admins as well. The other thing that I like about, there's two main things. The first is zero-day support for the Apple stuff. If Apple's coming down the pike with something new, I used to be concerned, oh no, is our product going to support it? But after working with Jamf for so long, I really don't have any worries anymore. When M1 was coming out, I'm you know what? I'm a little worried and I'll check in, but I'm 99% sure they're going to be ready on day one. And they were. So that's one thing that I always look forward to Jamf. And then the other thing is just their ability to continue to add new products to the suite. So like Jamf Connect Login, Jamf Protect, all this good stuff, but also implement new features within their existing products, especially Jamf Pro, that are based on user community feedback from admins like myself. So one clear example I can give is there was a recent, I think it was a couple months ago, maybe it was a little longer than that ago, but a huge update to patch reporting in Jamf. Like when patch reporting was initially implemented in Jamf Pro, it was a pretty big win in general, but the product list was kind of small. And Jamf heard that feedback from all of the user communities. Like, yeah, this is great, but there's only like 15 apps here. We have way more apps than that we need to get on. And now there's like hundreds in that list. So yeah, their ability to just like listen to the community, understand what their needs are. And I think that kind of goes back to kind of the core of what Jamf is. Like Jamf was started by a bunch of people who were trying to use like, custom scripts and daemons in order to manage Mac OS devices. So they understand that it's just in the core of the ethos of what Jamf is. It's like, we need to build new things to manage things better. So just that philosophy that Jamf has of saying, where are the problems? Let's identify them. Let's have a creative solution for it. And then let's make it easy to use and bring the product to market is something that they've demonstrated constantly. Jamf Pro console now, even compared to a year ago, there's so much extra bells and whistles. And you go back even further, you just see how far it's come. And so much of that is, yes, ingenuity within the company, but also the ability to listen and the willingness to listen to their customers and implement what they want to see.
Well, I'm glad we've got that track record, and I always like to say we're always listening, and it's something we build for our customers. A lot of the acquisitions we've made, our CEO will say we did it because our customers needed this and expressed that they needed this. So I really appreciate that. And I want to start wrapping up. What are some of your future goals you have when it comes to supporting your Apple devices? Any of our features or any of our solutions that you're looking to include in your overall infrastructure in the future? Or is there anything you're looking to further integrate with your existing setup? Would love to hear of any future goals that you have.
So one of the products I'm really excited about is Jamf Protect, because Jamf specializes in the Apple space. They've proven that they can do that in the MDM space, and I'm really excited to see them do that in the desktop security space as well. I think they've got their work cut out for them because it's a competitive landscape, but they've done it with the MDM side, so I don't see why they couldn't do it with the security side as well.
No, that's great. We look forward to supporting with that. Before we wrap up, any final thoughts that you want to share in your success and anything that perhaps we didn't cover today that you just want to let the listeners know before we wrap up as you're leveraging Jamf and Microsoft?
No, nothing major comes to mind. Just thanks again for the opportunity. I always love talking to people to make my life easier, and Jamf is definitely a company that's done that for many, many years now. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thom, for joining us today. I want to thank everyone for listening in. If you have any additional follow-up questions for us, again, I'm Kat Garbus, and we've got with us today Thom O'Connor. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day, for joining us for JNUC, and for participating in this session. Thank you so much, Thom, once again, and appreciate everyone listening in.